It was the storm that brought us there, the kind of tempest that feels alive, as if the wind itself has a grudge against you. Sheets of rain hammered down so hard they blurred the headlights, the world beyond the windscreen reduced to a black smear. The road was barely a suggestion, a winding snake swallowed by the darkness. That's when we saw it, squatting at the bend like some forgotten relic, an old inn, its signs swinging wildly in the gale, creaking like a ship's mast. We were four, a group thrown together by bad luck and shared destinations, work conferences, family obligations, a solo holiday that had gone sideways. I was driving, the others were strangers picked up at the last service station when the radio had warned about flooding ahead. We had nothing in common except the fear of dying in a ditch. So when the inn loomed out of the storm like some grim lighthouse, we didn't hesitate. We pulled in. The place was odd. From the outside, it seemed ancient, as though it had been standing there for centuries, quietly rotting, the kind of place where the walls remember too much. But inside it was warm, too warm, a roaring fire in the hearth, every surface gleaming like someone had just polished it. The innkeeper, if that's what he was, appeared almost as soon as we stepped inside. He didn't say a word, just nodded and gestured. A tall man, all angles and hollows, his face long and pale like a wilted flower. His eyes were strange, too dark like twin pits dug deep into his skull. He showed us to our rooms. There were enough for all of us, which felt strange, given how small the place had looked from the outside. My room smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, like old flowers left too long in water. The bed was firm, the sheets crisp. For a moment I thought we'd stumbled onto a gem, some forgotten treasure of hospitality, but the longer I stayed, the harder it became to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The others felt it too. I could tell from the way they lingered in the common room, avoiding their rooms as though the walls had ears. The innkeeper brought us food, a thick stew, crusty bread, a bottle of wine, but he never spoke. Just appeared when needed and vanished like smoke. His movements were too fluid, too quiet. You'd turn around, and there he'd be, standing in the doorway with that faint, unsettling smile. The storm raged on, the wind screamed, rattling the shutters like it wanted in. It went on for hours, then a whole day, then two. By the third night, the inn didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a trap. I started noticing things, little things, the way the fire never seemed to burn down, no matter how long it blazed. The way the shadows in the corners seemed to twist and crawl when you weren't looking. The way the innkeeper's smile grew wider each time he appeared, stretching across his face until it looked like his skin might split. None of us talked about it. What could we say? We were trapped by the storm, and the innkeeper was helpful, too helpful. Always there with fresh towels or a pot of tea or a stack of books that looked suspiciously new. The others avoided his eyes. I found myself avoiding the mirrors, though I couldn't have told you why. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. It happened suddenly, like someone had thrown a switch. One moment the wind was howling, the rain lashing, the next there was silence. A grey, uneasy calm. We left as soon as we could, piling back into the car without so much as a thank you. The innkeeper watched us go from the porch, that too wide smile still plastered across his face. As we drove away, I glanced back and saw him standing there, motionless, his dark eyes following us until the inn disappeared behind a bend. It was only later, when we reached the village, that we asked about the place. A few friendly faces, a pub that smelled of beer and damp wood, and we mentioned the inn at the bend, how it had saved us from the storm. The smiles froze. The air changed. One old man set his pint down with a trembling hand and said, "You must be mistaken." We weren't. We described it in detail. The roaring fire, the gleaming floors, the silent innkeeper with the hollow eyes. That's when they told us about the fire 20 years ago, how the inn had burned to the ground in the middle of a storm, trapping the innkeeper inside. They said they'd found his body in the ruins, his face frozen in a rictus grin. The island wasn't supposed to be haunted, that's what they told us. We'd signed up for the lighthouse restoration project during a particularly bleak week at university, the kind of week where deadlines and rainy afternoons make even the most outlandish ideas seem like a good one. "A little adventure," they said. "A chance to make history." The island, only accessible by a rusted ferry twice a week, was barren save for the lighthouse and a crumbling keeper's cottage. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi. Just a wind-blasted rock jutting out into the sea, surrounded by jagged teeth of black stone that screamed of shipwrecks and sorrow. But we were college kids, hungry for stories to tell and eager to escape the monotony of lectures and pub crawls. There were 5 of us: me, Ethan, Claire, Jules, and Nick. We brought beer, sleeping bags, and the kind of blind optimism that comes only from being young and stupid. The ferry captain, a grizzled man who barely said a word, had muttered something about bad weather coming as he dropped us off. I remember thinking the lighthouse didn't look so bad at first glance, despite its peeling paint and weather-beaten walls. It stood tall and proud against the slate-grey sky, a sentinel of the past. The first day was all laughter and light work, cleaning out cobwebs, hauling up buckets of seawater to scrub the stone floors, marveling at the view from the top. The place smelled of salt and mildew, and every step on the spiral staircase echoed like a gunshot. Ethan joked that the lighthouse felt alive, and we all laughed, but I saw the way Claire glanced at the shadows gathering in the corners. The light itself was still intact, a massive, ancient Fresnel lens that caught the sun and scattered it into rainbows. The bulb was dead, of course, and the power long since disconnected. The keepers had abandoned the place decades ago after automation rendered their jobs obsolete. It felt like a grave, honestly, but we didn't say that aloud. The first night we heard the wind. That's all it was at first, just wind howling around the tower like an animal in pain. We huddled in our sleeping bags on the ground floor, drinking and telling ghost stories, trying to outdo each other. Outside, the sea churned angrily against the rocks, and the lighthouse stood firm, its darkened lamp an unseeing eye. Then the light came on. It started with a low hum, barely noticeable beneath the wail of the wind. A faint, flickering glow spilled through the cracks in the wooden door leading to the spiral staircase. Nick was the first to notice it, his beer can frozen halfway to his mouth. The laughter died, replaced by a silence so thick you could choke on it. We all stared at that door, waiting for someone else to say what we were all thinking, that it wasn't possible. The power was off, the light pulsed once, twice, then steadied into a cold, white beam that cut through the storm outside. Curiosity, they say, kills the cat, but we weren't cats. We were young and reckless and just stupid enough to climb those stairs. All 5 of us crammed into the narrow spiral, our footsteps loud against the iron steps. The higher we climbed, the colder it got, until our breath fogged the air in front of us. At the top, the light was blinding. It spun slowly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then we saw it. A figure stood in the beam, silhouetted against the glass. It was waving, no, not waving, signaling. An arm raised in desperation, then lowered over and over again, like someone begging for help. The figure turned slowly, and for a moment, I swear, it looked right at me, though its face was shrouded in shadow. We bolted down the stairs. No one spoke, no one dared to look back. The rest of the night was a blur of whispered fears and restless shifting in our sleeping bags. But none of us left the ground floor again. The light continued to turn, casting its relentless glow over the empty sea. The next day, we told ourselves it was a trick of the storm, a power surge, maybe some old wiring we hadn't noticed. But when Ethan tried to check the lamp mechanism, he found nothing. The bulb was still blown. No power, no explanation. That night, the light came on again. And this time, we heard them. Voices, faint at first, like the sound of a radio tuned just off frequency. They rose and fell with the wind, mingling with the crash of waves until they became a chorus of anguish, screams, sobs, shouts. Each one distinct, layered atop the other like some hellish symphony. We tried to block it out, stuffing our ears with whatever we could find, but it was no use. The voices were inside the walls, inside our heads, and then the light began to stutter, casting disjointed images on the floor. Shadowy figures, men in oilskins, faces twisted in fear, appeared and disappeared in the beam, replaying some silent, endless tragedy. It was Jules who figured it out. The lighthouse had been the site of a disaster decades ago when a ship had veered off course in the fog and smashed into the rocks below. The keepers had been blamed for failing to light the lamp in time, though they swore it had been working. All hands lost. The papers had called it a tragedy of errors, but it wasn't errors, it was the lighthouse. We saw them again on the 3rd night. The keepers. They were trapped in the beam, their faces twisted into masks of pain and terror, reliving the moment the ship struck the rocks. Over and over, the same scene played out. Their ghostly hands gripping invisible controls, their mouths open in silent screams. By the time we decided to leave, it was too late. The storm had swallowed the island, and the ferry wouldn't return for days. We sat in the keeper's cottage, huddled together, too afraid to sleep, as the light turned and turned, its hum drilling into our skulls. I don't know how we survived those final nights. By the time the ferry arrived, we were shadows of ourselves, hollow-eyed and shaking. The captain took one look at us and said nothing. We never talked about it afterward. Not to each other, not to anyone, sub. But I still see the light sometimes when I close my eyes. And I know it's still out there, spinning in the dark, waiting for the next set of fools to step inside. Grief is like a hole in the chest, a jagged wound where something essential used to be. It doesn't close, it just scars over, pulsing with phantom pain when you least expect it. That's how it was with Jamie. My son, my bright, beautiful boy, gone too soon. One moment he was there, laughing and chasing bubbles in the garden. The next he was a still form in a hospital bed, his small body unable to fight the fever that had gripped him. The doctors called it a tragic anomaly. I called it a cruel joke. After the funeral, the house felt like a mausoleum. Every corner was saturated with his absence, every toy and photograph a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. His room, with its faded rocket ship wallpaper and shelves of dinosaurs, was a shrine I couldn't bear to dismantle. At night, I'd sit at the edge of his bed, clutching the stuffed lion he'd named Benny, and cry until my throat was raw. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a dream. A soft patter of footsteps, the unmistakable shuffle of little feet on the wooden floorboards. It came from the hallway, creeping closer to my bedroom door. My heart clenched, and for a wild, desperate moment, I thought Jamie. The rational part of me, the part that had signed the death certificate, stood by the grave and thanked people for their sympathy, knew it couldn't be. But grief does strange things to the mind. I sat up, the mattress creaking beneath me, and listened. The sound stopped. It happened again the next night, and the night after that, always the same. Those light, hesitant footsteps, just like Jamie's when he used to pad to my room after a bad dream. I tried telling myself it was the house settling, or maybe a mouse. But there were no mice, no creaks or groans that matched the rhythm of a child's steps. By the third night, I wasn't scared. I was hopeful. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of wind through a cracked window. But I recognized it instantly. Jamie's laugh, a high, melodic giggle that always bubbled up when he found something absurdly funny, like the time he saw our neighbor's cat stuck in a hedge. It came from the living room, a soft, airy sound that made my chest tighten and my pulse race. I ran downstairs, half expecting to see him sitting on the couch, legs swinging over the edge. The room was empty. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the auditory equivalent of seeing his face in the crowd. But then I noticed the toys, his dinosaurs, which I had carefully arranged on his shelf, were scattered across the floor in a haphazard circle. Benny the lion was propped up against the coffee table as though someone had been playing tea party. My stomach turned to lead. By the end of the week, things escalated. I'd wake to find crumbs on the kitchen counter, juice boxes missing from the fridge, Jamie's favorite books, dog-eared copies of Where the Wild Things Are and Goodnight Moon, would appear on the coffee table, open to his favorite pages. At first, I wanted to believe it was him, my Jamie, somehow finding his way back to me. The thought brought a sick sort of comfort, like pressing a cold compress to a burn, but it wasn't right. It wasn't just Jamie. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt something tug at the edge of my duvet. A light, insistent pull, the way Jamie used to do when he wanted to climb in beside me. My heart thundered in my chest, torn between hope and dread. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The duvet was yanked harder, almost violently, and I bolted upright. In the darkness I saw it, a small shape at the foot of the bed, silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlight outside. My breath caught. It looked like Jamie. The messy curls, the slight tilt of his head. But something was wrong. The outline was jagged, flickering, as though it couldn't quite hold itself together. "Jamie," I whispered before I could stop myself. It tilted its head further, almost quizzically. Then it moved. A jerky, unnatural motion, like a puppet on tangled strings. It skittered across the floor and disappeared into the hallway. My body was frozen, my mind screaming at me to do something, but all I could do was sit there, trembling. The next morning I found scratches on the walls of Jamie's room, deep, gouging marks that spelled out nothing I could understand. The toys were arranged again, but this time they weren't playful. The dinosaurs were lined up in a circle, their heads all turned inward as though waiting for something. Benny sat in the center, his button eyes dull and accusing. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was grief, stress, lack of sleep, but the thing wearing my son's face grew bolder. At night it would pace the halls, its steps heavy and deliberate. I'd hear it breathing, deep guttural rasps that shook the silence. Once I caught a glimpse of it in the mirror, not Jamie, not even close. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide, filled with teeth that didn't belong in a child's mouth. I tried to confront it. I begged, pleaded, screamed for it to leave me alone. That's when it turned violent. Doors slammed shut on their own, picture frames shattered. The air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. It started appearing closer, always just at the edge of the light, its form twisting and writhing like smoke. The last straw came when I woke to find it standing over me, its face inches from mine. It didn't speak, but I felt its intent, cold, cruel, and utterly devoid of anything human. This wasn't Jamie. It had never been Jamie. I left the house that night, clutching only my car keys and Benny, the only thing I couldn't bear to leave behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The thing was standing in the doorway, watching me with eyes that burned like coals. I don't know what it was, but I know it's still there, waiting, and I know I'll never go back. We bought the house at auction on the cheap. A once stately building perched on a hill overlooking the grey waters of the North Sea. It had been closed for decades, left to sag under the weight of salt air and time. My wife, Helen, called it a new beginning. The kids weren't so sure, but they didn't protest much. A fresh start, we'd told them, a chance to build something of our own. From the moment we stepped through the warped double doors, I could feel the history pressing down on me. The air was thick, laced with mildew and something sharper, harder to define. It wasn't exactly a smell, it was a sensation, like walking into a room where a secret had just been whispered, and the echoes were still clinging to the walls. The main hall was enormous, the kind of space meant for grandeur. Vaulted ceilings, a sweeping staircase, a chandelier that had rusted into a lifeless husk. Dust coated everything, softening the sharp edges of decay. My youngest, Jamie, ran his fingers through it and left trails across the dark wood banister. Helen smiled, her face lighting up with that determined optimism I'd fallen in love with years ago. We spent the first weeks clearing out debris, peeling back the layers of neglect to see what could be salvaged. The kids helped at first, but quickly grew bored. They'd disappear into the garden or climb the jagged cliffs behind the inn. Jamie claimed he found an old grave marker back there, but I brushed it off as childish imagination. It wasn't until the first night we slept there that things began to feel wrong. The sound started softly, just after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind. The inn creaked and groaned as though it were alive, settling its ancient bones. But as I lay awake, the noises grew clearer, more distinct. Laughter, the faint clink of glasses, the rhythmic murmur of voices engaged in conversation. I got out of bed, certain the kids were playing a prank, but when I checked their rooms, they were fast asleep. The noise followed me as I wandered the inn, always just beyond the reach of my torchlight. The dining room was empty, so was the kitchen. Yet as I stood there, the sound of footsteps echoed from the floor above me. By morning, the noises were gone. The sunlight poured through the cracked windows, and everything looked mundane again. Helen laughed at my concerns, chalking it up to exhaustion. But the feeling stayed with me, a prickle at the base of my spine, an awareness of being watched. As the days passed, the sounds grew bolder. What had started as faint murmurs turned into a cacophony. The clatter of dishes echoed from the dining room, though the tables remained untouched. Footsteps rushed up and down the hallways, yet no one was there. One evening, I swore I felt someone brush past me, their presence cold and fleeting, leaving a faint scent of tobacco in the air. Helen started noticing it too. She'd pause in the middle of a task, her head cocked as though straining to hear. The kids grew restless, Jamie especially. He refused to go upstairs alone, claiming he'd seen shadows move where there shouldn't be any. It was Helen who found the ledger. She'd been cleaning out the office when she uncovered it, tucked away in a drawer that had swelled shut with moisture. The handwriting was neat, precise, documenting years of guests who had stayed at the inn. The last entries were dated November 1938. The entries stopped abruptly, mid-page, as though the writer had been interrupted. But it wasn't the ledger itself that disturbed me, it was the margin notes, scribbled hastily in a different hand. They hinted at something terrible. Too many, must stop, they'll drown. The history of the place began to unravel. We discovered the inn had closed after a tragedy, though the details were murky. Locals we spoke to would grow quiet when we mentioned it, their eyes darting away. We pieced together fragments: a storm, a party gone horribly wrong, guests who had never left. We considered leaving. Helen even started packing. But the inn wouldn't let us go. One night I woke to the sound of music, an old gramophone playing a crackling waltz. When I stepped into the hallway, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of perfume. The inn was alive, filled with the shimmer of a bygone era. Shadows flitted past me, translucent figures dressed in evening wear, their faces locked in expressions of joy and despair. I turned the corner and found Helen standing in the dining room, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was holding a tray of glasses, offering them to no one. Behind her, the tables were set for a banquet, the plates and cutlery pristine. A crowd filled the room, though I could see through them as clearly as I could see the wall behind them. When I touched Helen's shoulder, the vision shattered. The crowd disappeared, leaving only the oppressive silence and the faint clink of a glass rolling to the floor. We couldn't stay, but we couldn't leave either. The inn had taken something from us, our sense of time, our grip on reality. When we tried to escape, the road always seemed to loop back, bringing us to its crumbling facade. The guests, the spirits, grew angrier. Their laughter turned to screams. Their footsteps became pounding. One night, the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with their rage. We're still here, trapped in the inn's decayed grasp. We are its caretakers now, though there's nothing to care for except the echoes of the past. Somewhere outside, the world moves on. But here, time stands still and the guests demand their due. It started with the urn. My wife found it at an estate sale in one of those posh old neighbourhoods where the houses all sit too close together, staring each other down like retired monarchs. Lydia loved poking through other people's cast-offs. The weirder, the better. She called it treasure hunting, and when she saw the urn, a tall, blackened bronze thing with intricate swirling designs, her eyes lit up. It was, she said, perfect for the mantelpiece, a touch of old-world charm, something with a story to it. I wasn't so sure. Something about it unsettled me right off the bat. It wasn't ugly, but there was a weight to it, like it carried more than its shape suggested. Lydia brushed off my reluctance, laughing as she handed over 20 quid to the estate agent. "It's a steal," she'd said, clutching it like she'd just found the Holy Grail. Looking back, I wish I'd smashed it there and then. It didn't seem ominous at first, just another antique trinket in a house full of them. Lydia cleaned it up, running a cloth over its tarnished surface until it gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She set it on the mantel in the living room, just above the fireplace that never got used. It did look good there, I had to admit, adding a sombre elegance to the room. Lydia was thrilled. For a while that was that. Then the dreams started. At first, they were fleeting, disjointed things, a flash of flames, the heat so real I'd wake up sweating, my skin prickling as if I'd been too close to a bonfire. There were faces too, blurry and indistinct, but twisted in agony, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. I told myself it was stress, the usual byproduct of juggling work and family life, but Lydia started complaining about bad dreams too, and that's when I began to worry. The first time I saw one of them, I thought it was a trick of the light. It was late, past midnight, and I'd gotten up for a glass of water. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan in the floorboards. As I passed the living room, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A figure standing by the mantel, tall with jagged edges like the shape of a person burnt into a photograph. When I turned to look directly, it was gone. I didn't say anything to Lydia. What was there to say? That I'd seen a ghost? A trick of the shadows? She'd laugh it off, call me paranoid. And maybe I was, but it kept happening. Charred figures, always at the edges of my vision, flickering like smoke, sometimes by the mantel, sometimes in the hallway, once at the foot of our bed. They never stayed long, vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. The air around them was always heavy, thick with the faint acrid tang of burnt wood. Lydia noticed it too, though she wouldn't admit it at first. She'd stiffen in the kitchen, her eyes darting to the doorway as if she'd heard something. Once she dropped a plate, staring past me with a look of such raw fear it made my stomach drop. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head, muttering about being overtired. The kids started acting strangely as well. Sophie, our youngest, refused to go near the living room, saying it smelled funny. Jack, our teenager, joked about the house being haunted, though his laugh was strained, his eyes darting nervously toward the mantel. It wasn't just the figures, either. Little things started going wrong. The lights flickered at odd times, plunging us into sudden darkness. The television turned itself on, static crackling through the speakers. The smell of smoke became more pronounced, clinging to our clothes, seeping into the walls. One night, the fire alarm went off. We bolted out of bed, hearts racing, but there was no fire, no smoke, just the damned alarm blaring its shrill warning into the night. When we finally got it to stop, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The urn was warm to the touch. That's when I started digging. Lydia didn't like it, said I was being ridiculous, but I needed to know where it had come from. The estate agent was less than helpful, claiming the items had come from a private collector. I scoured local news archives, looking for anything that might explain the strange happenings. That's when I found it. A fire decades ago at a boarding house not far from where we lived. Dozens of people trapped inside, the building reduced to ash and rubble. There were whispers of negligence, even arson, though no one was ever held accountable. The ashes of the victims had been scattered, or so the official records claimed. But what if they hadn't? That night, the figures stopped hiding. They came in droves, their burnt forms crowding the edges of the room, pressing closer and closer until I could see the charred flesh, the hollow eyes that stared without blinking. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and scorched hair. Lydia screamed, clutching the kids to her chest as I tried to shield them, my own terror threatening to swallow me whole. And then they spoke, not with words, but with a suffocating wave of rage and sorrow that washed over us, filling the room with their anguish. It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. They thought we were responsible, as if we'd somehow been complicit in their deaths. Their suffering. I don't remember much after that, just chaos, screaming, a frantic scramble to get out of the house, to get away from whatever was in there with us. The urn stayed behind. We never went back. The house sold quickly, to another family who probably thought it was a steal. I didn't have the heart to warn them. What would I even say? But sometimes in the dead of night, I still smell smoke. The building had seen better days. It squatted at the edge of a grimy cul-de-sac, its brickwork streaked with soot and weathered scars. The sort of place where people came and went so quickly that nobody bothered to learn their names. I wasn't proud of owning it, but business was business. A landlord can't afford sentimentality, not when rent keeps the lights on at home. Flat 3B had been vacant for a while. Too many complaints about the state of the building, the bad wiring, the drafts, and the smell of damp seeping through the plaster. But the girl who called seemed desperate, the kind of desperation that glossed over cracks in the walls and the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways. She needed somewhere cheap and fast. 3B was exactly that. Kaylee moved in on a Thursday. She was polite, young, with a frazzled air about her, like life had been pressing its thumb down on her for too long. I handed her the keys and told her to call if she needed anything. She smiled, tight-lipped, and hauled her suitcase over the threshold without a second glance. 2 weeks later, the calls started. At first, it was small things. Strange noises at night, footsteps in the hallways, the shuffle of movement in the flat next door. She brushed it off as the quirks of living in an old building, but then she mentioned the neighbor. "An old man," she said, in the flat next to mine. "He's always there. He watches me when I leave for work, doesn't say much, just stares." Her voice on the phone was tight with unease, but I reassured her. That flat had been empty since the fire, and no one had keys but me. Maybe it was someone from the building passing by her window. Old buildings creak, noises echo. She sounded doubtful, but agreed to let it go until the aggression started. "He knocked on my door last night," she told me a week later, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. Pounding so hard it woke me up. When I asked what he wanted, he just kept shouting about his things. His things, he said. I'd taken them. I haven't touched anything. I told her I'd come by and check it out. Maybe squatters had broken into the other flat. It wouldn't be the first time in this neighborhood. But when I arrived, the hallway outside 3B was silent, the air heavy with the musty scent of old wood and mildew. I knocked on Kaylee's door and she answered, looking pale, eyes darting nervously over my shoulder as if she expected to see someone there. I checked the neighboring flat. Dust coated every surface, untouched for months since the fire had gutted the place. The walls were stained with soot, the air still thick with the faint acrid tang of charred wood. No signs of a squatter, no signs of anyone. Kaylee stood in her doorway, arms folded tightly around herself, and glared at me when I said as much. "He's real," she insisted. "I've seen him. I've talked to him." The next call came in the middle of the night. "He's outside my door," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "He's been there for hours. He keeps saying I shouldn't be here, that this is his flat. Please, you have to come." I didn't argue. I threw on a coat and drove over, my gut twisted into a knot. The building was silent when I arrived. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your own breathing sound too loud. Kaylee was curled up on the couch, clutching a knife, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She pointed to the door next to hers. "He's in there," she whispered. I unlocked the flat, the key grinding in the rusty lock, and stepped inside. Empty. Just the same dusty, charred room I'd seen before. But the air felt wrong, thick and cloying, like stepping into a furnace that had gone cold, and there in the far corner of the room was a chair. A blackened chair. I'd seen it before. It was one of the few things they'd pulled from the wreckage after the fire that had killed Mr. Dobson. The old man had lived there for decades, a stubborn recluse who refused to leave even when the wiring in the building had become dangerously frayed. He died in his sleep when the fire swept through the flat, and the place had been a husk ever since. "Mr. Dobson," I muttered under my breath, my skin prickling with a sudden icy chill. Kaylee screamed. I spun around, but there was no one there, just her backing into the corner of her flat, her gaze fixed on something behind me. "He's there!" she shrieked. "He's right there!" I felt it before I saw it, the oppressive weight of a presence, the air growing colder, heavier. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him. A shape, blackened and charred, hunched in the shadows. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of anger so raw and consuming it drove the breath from my lungs. I didn't stay, I didn't argue. I grabbed Kaylee by the arm and pulled her out of the flat, her protest drowned by the sound of splintering wood and the faint, acrid scent of smoke. We never went back. 3B is still vacant. I've sealed it off, told myself it's for renovations, but I know the truth. No one will ever live there again. The dare began like most stupid things do, with a mix of bravado and boredom. It was Owen's idea, naturally. He was the kind of guy who thrived on pushing the rest of us into things we didn't want to do, his cocky grin daring anyone to say no. So when he mentioned the legend of the graveyard during the walk home from the pub, we all knew where it was heading. I didn't believe in ghost stories, none of us did really. But there was something about Owen's tone that night, the way he described the old cemetery on the hill, the one no one visited anymore. He painted a picture vivid enough to worm into your mind. The iron gates leaning like broken teeth, the headstones crooked and moss-covered, and the little detail that made it irresistible, the warning carved into the arch above the entrance. Disturb the dead and join them. It was a full moon that night, the kind that bathes everything in an unnatural silvery light. The air had a bite to it too, sharp enough to sting your lungs when you breathed in. The kind of night where everything feels a little too quiet, a little too still, like the world's holding its breath. We climbed the hill, laughing and shoving each other, the way you do when you're trying to ignore the gnawing pit of unease in your stomach. The graveyard was exactly as Owen described it. The wrought iron gate groaned when we pushed it open, and the rows of weathered tombstones stretched out before us like jagged teeth in a rotting mouth. Owen was the first to step onto a grave. He danced a slow, mocking jig, his boots kicking up dust as he called us all cowards. It didn't take long for the rest of us to follow. Peer pressure's a funny thing. You don't even realize how deep it runs until you're doing something you'd never consider on your own. We jumped and spun and stomped, our laughter echoing in the stillness. My feet hit the soft earth of a grave marked Margaret Dawes, 1856 to 1882, and for a moment I hesitated. She was only 26, I thought my age, but Owen shoved me and the hesitation passed. I laughed, louder than I should have, and the sound seemed to hang in the air too long, like the night itself was listening. It started with the wind. Not a normal wind, the kind that rustles leaves and whispers through the branches. This one came out of nowhere, sharp and sudden, cutting through the graveyard like a knife. It carried with it a smell I can only describe as rot, earthy and sour and wrong. And then the ground moved. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a slight shifting beneath our feet, like the earth was breathing. But it was enough to make us stop, our laughter choking off as we looked at each other, unsure if this was part of the joke. And then Margaret Dawes sat up. Her face was a sunken mask of decay, her eyes hollow pits that seemed to draw in the moonlight. The ground split open around her as she rose, the same way a flower pushes through the soil. Only this flower had claws. She wasn't alone. All around us the graves were coming to life. Hands clawed through the dirt, skeletal fingers grasping at the air. Figures emerged, dragging themselves from the earth in jerking, unnatural movements, their bodies twisted by the ways they had died. One man's head lolled at an impossible angle, his neck snapped like a twig. Another had a gaping hole in his chest as though something had been ripped out of him. A woman stumbled forward, her dress charred and blackened, the smell of smoke and burnt flesh clinging to her. We ran, or at least we tried. The dead were faster than they had any right to be, their movements sharp and jerky like puppets on tangled strings. Owen was the first to go. He tripped, of course, his cocky grin gone, replaced by a scream that cut through the night. Margaret Dawes was on him in seconds, her bony fingers closing around his throat. He didn't die cleanly. She dragged him back to her grave, her claws raking across his flesh as the earth swallowed them both. The others scattered, but it didn't matter. The dead knew this place better than we did. They hunted us with a purpose, each one seeking out a victim as though they'd been waiting for this moment. I saw Tim fall, his legs yanked out from under him by a man with a gaping chest wound. He screamed as the dead man plunged his skeletal hand into his chest, pulling and tearing until the screaming stopped. I didn't look back after that. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe the dead had already claimed enough, or maybe they let me go to spread the warning. All I know is that when I reached the gate, the wind stopped and the night went still again. The graveyard looked the same as it had before, but the silence was heavier now, like the world itself was waiting. The others were gone. The police said there was no evidence of foul play, just some scuffed dirt and my hysterical ramblings. But I know what I saw. I don't laugh much anymore, and I never ever dance. I should have known better than to trust the brochure. It promised everything I needed, a week of solitude, inspiration and quiet for my writing. A grand mansion tucked away on the edge of a sprawling moor, far from the distractions of modern life. I was struggling with my novel, lost in the middle of it, and figured a change of scenery would do me good. It was only a week after all, a single week. The mansion was everything I expected and more. It loomed on a hill half hidden by ancient oaks that whispered in the wind, the kind of place you expect to find in the pages of an old Gothic novel. The moment I arrived, the air was thick with a kind of oppressive stillness, as if time itself had given up trying to flow here. The owner, an old man with thick spectacles, handed me the key and muttered something about the house being special, but I didn't think much of it. Who doesn't get a little eccentric when they grow old, I thought. He rattled off a few things about not venturing into the cellar or the attic, but the details slipped past me as I stepped into the mansion's grand hallway. The light from the setting sun filtered through the tall, dust-coated windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. I spent the first couple of days settling in, exploring the place, trying to write. The house was massive, with long hallways that seemed to stretch forever, rooms that opened into rooms, and corridors that led to dead ends, as if they had once been part of something bigger. I found a library, a study, a sitting room with velvet curtains and a piano that had long since gone silent. The entire house smelled of age and dust. Familiar, comforting, but then, on the third night, things changed. I had spent the evening scribbling in my notebook, listening to the wind batter the windows as I struggled to put words together. By midnight, I decided to take a break. I needed some air. The mansion was as quiet as death, not even a mouse stirring in the corners. I wandered down one of the corridors I hadn't yet explored and turned the corner into a large dining room. And there it was, a long, polished dining table set for a banquet, though no one had invited me to dinner. The tablecloth shimmered under the dim light of the chandelier above. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and fine china were arranged neatly at each place, but what struck me as odd was the number of seats, at least 20. And each seat was filled. Shadowy figures sat perfectly still, their faces obscured in the low light, as if the darkness had claimed their features. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to leave, but I couldn't. I felt drawn to them, compelled, as if some invisible force were holding me there, forcing me to witness whatever this was. As I stepped closer, I saw the first detail that turned my blood to ice. Each of the figures was tied to the chair with thick black ropes, tight enough that their skin was pinched and swollen beneath the binding. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and I took a shaky breath, trying to make sense of it. Were they guests? But no one had been invited. The mansion was supposed to be empty. I approached one figure cautiously, my feet feeling as though they were glued to the floor. The closer I got, the clearer the faces became. No, not faces, but what remained of them. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes hollow, and I could see the faintest glimmer of something beneath the pallor of death. A smile, frozen, warped. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. Panic clawed at my chest, suffocating me. These were not just shadows. They were real once, but now they were something else, something far worse. Each of the figures had a symbol etched into their clothing, a faint, dark mark near their collar, as though something had branded them. My head swirled, my mind raced for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out everything else. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I had to get out of there. I turned on my heels and ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, my legs barely carrying me. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me. I was lost, my mind a frantic blur, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But then, as I ran through the darkened corridors, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, menacing. The mask it wore was featureless, but there was something terrifying in its blankness. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them burning through the mask. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but I knew it wasn't waiting for me to come closer. It was waiting for me to panic. I didn't stop running. I turned and bolted down the nearest staircase, my breath ragged in my throat. But when I reached the bottom, there was no escape. The door I had passed through before had vanished. In its place stood a wall, solid, untouched, as if it had never been there, and that's when I saw the axe. The figure raised it slowly, the blade catching what little light there was. My skin turned cold as ice. I tried to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. The mask remained still, unblinking, unmoving. Then the figure stepped forward. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the cold steel of the axe glinting in the dark.